Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Jon Huntsman, Chairman of the Atlantic Council. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the Council this afternoon for a dynamic and thought-provoking conversation on the ISIS threat and how the United States and its partners and allies can best prepare for the likelihood of escalation by ISIS. Now, this event builds on an off-the-record, high-level war game recently conducted by the Brent Scowcroft Center's Middle East Peace and Security Initiative, and more broadly as part of a larger effort that the Council is undertaking on the rise of non-state actors and the associated threats and challenges to nation-states and the global order. More than 5 months have passed since President Obama delivered a speech outlining the administration's strategy to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS. As the U.S. formulates a plan to retake Mosul, alongside Iraqi forces, the U.S. military have set a goal of restoring Iraqi control of its territory and its borders by the end of 2015. But ISIS continues to disrupt regional security, not to mention continually perpetrating horrific attacks. To be sure, ISIS is indicative of a more endemic problem, that of continuing rise in power of a wide range of non-state actors in key regions across the world. This trend is bearing out the era of individual empowerment that was outlined in the NIC's Global Trends 2030 report. A group in a remote part of the world is able to deny the sovereignty of two states and claim part of each as its own, with no immediate challenge. We recently had the pleasure of hosting high-level foreign officials from the region, and over the course of our discussion, it was readily apparent that the United States must lead the fight against ISIS. In a closed-door strategy session in Kuwait earlier this week, U.S. Secretary of Defense Ash Carter stated, "This is a campaign in which the world's values and future are bound together. ISIL is not just a threat to Iraq and Syria, it's a larger threat to the region." Now, our speakers today will discuss how the United States can best address not only the current threat, but also major strategic challenges going forward. I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming to the stage General James Cartwright, Harold Brown Chair for Defense Policy Studies at CSIS and Atlantic Council board member. General Cartwright was appointed the 8th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a position he held across two presidential administrations, after serving as commander of U.S. Strategic Command. Welcome, Jim. We're delighted to have you with us. Joining General Cartwright is the Council's own fearless leader, Fred Kempe. He has served as president and CEO of this wonderful organization since 2006, and we're absolutely delighted that he's willing to join us today for this discussion. I'm also pleased to welcome Julie Smith to our panel. Julie serves as a senior fellow and director of the Strategy and Statecraft program at the Center for a New American Security. Having previously served as the Deputy National Security Advisor to the Vice President of the United States from 2012 to 2013, her insights today will be absolutely invaluable. Last but certainly not least is Bilal Saab, our senior fellow for Middle East Security in the Council's Brent Scowcroft Center and co-chair of the ISIS War Game Series. Bilal brings a tremendous amount of Middle East expertise to this discussion. His latest work on strategic defense and security issues in the Levant and the Gulf will be particularly useful in today's discussion. Our moderator today is none other than Gideon Rose, editor of Foreign Affairs and our media partner for this effort. I can't think of a better person to moderate this very important discussion. Thank you, Gideon, for joining us. Before I get started, I'd like to thank once again Bilal Saab and Lieutenant Colonel Mike Tyson, United States Marine Corps, for all of their hard work in orchestrating the war game, as well as Mari Janica and Tiara Shea for organizing this discussion today. Again, thank you one and all for joining us. Gideon, the stage is yours, my friend.
Thank you very much, Governor. So, should we go? Let's bring the whole panel up here, kind of thing. I'll just do this. Okay. So since we're all mic'd, we can sit here. So Fred, you're here. So As Governor Huntsman said, this follows on to an off-the-record war game that was played out yesterday on this issue of sort of an ISIS escalation and how outside powers and local powers would respond. So before we get started in our discussion, Bilal, why don't you just brief the people here about whatever you can about sort of what happened and how that went as a good sort of intro to the discussion.
Thank you, Gideon. I know that the governor has thanked a number of people who were instrumental in working on the war game, but bear with me. I want to thank a few more, if you don't mind, because this has been a massive effort, frankly, over the past 2 months. So Mari, Alex Ward, Tiara, Alex Clayton, Morgan McSwain, Paul Paliga, Kate Sager, and the rest of the comms team. It's been a pleasure working with you, and this was really a massive team effort. So Mike and I, get the credit, but it doesn't stop there. I just wanted to provide some background because, this is war game number 2. Some of the people in the audience were wondering, well, what happened in war game number 1? For the first one, which we did sometime in September of last year, we analyzed the military stalemate that ensued between the coalition led by the United States and ISIS. It was a fairly basic prediction. The military stalemate ensued, and we were trying to analyze basically whether that would be broken anytime soon. So comes the second war game, basically, where we actually specifically looked at 2 scenarios that we picked where the stalemate would be broken as a result of escalation on the part of ISIS, and how the United States and its partners and allies would respond to such contingencies. Now, you can come up with all sorts of scenarios, basically, that you want, but we just chose 2 that we thought would be particularly useful and would have some immediate policy relevance for this administration and even perhaps the one after. So the 2 scenarios that we picked are as follows. We had a number of teams, basically, if some of you are familiar with wargaming. We had a number of teams who basically played, blue, whether it's the United States, red as ISIS, brown, what we call the bad guys, that's Russia, the Syrian government, and the Iranian government, and green, basically, the major allies and partners in the coalition, whether it's the Europeans, the Arab Gulf states, the Iraqi government, and Turkey itself. So the first scenario looked at basically the possibility of ISIS taking over at least several Sunni parts of Baghdad. We didn't go overboard with taking over basically the entirety of Baghdad. We thought that would be a little bit too implausible, even though it's not unthinkable. And the second one was, the typical scenario that we'd typically find in war games, which was a spectacular terrorist attack by ISIS at Al-Assad Air Base, where there's a good amount of U.S. personnel. So with that, I just wanted to provide some context for the discussion, and I'll turn it over back to you, Gideon.
Okay, so the United States gets trapped in a thankless war in a developing country where it doesn't really have a great deal of local political order to build on, ultimately tries to extricate itself from that and walk away, does so after achieving a sort of relatively calm stalemate, and a couple of years later things start to go to hell, and then the real questions about just what the United States was fighting for and why and what it should do now start to come to the fore. This applies obviously both now and 40 years ago. Exactly. The question of what the United States can and should do in Syria and Iraq now, in the wake of the U.S. involvement in the Iraq War, in the wake of the U.S. To a certain extent staying on the sidelines of the Syrian civil war, when the result of those things has been the rise of ISIS on the ground, that has sort of surprised everybody and dismayed everybody and has moved forward, is the sort of context for these general questions of what we should do now. There have been sort of 3 broad possible ways the United States could have responded to ISIS, I think, right? One is you could have said, look, this is really, we're out of this, we stayed out of Syria, we got out of Iraq, this is not our problem, we're washing our hands of it. Even though we didn't say we were going to, and we didn't intend to, it's too much trouble to re-engage now. We haven't chosen that route. Another is we're going to go back in full force and try to reestablish political order directly and in effect recolonize the area ourselves. We didn't choose that either. So what we've essentially done is try to contain the situation, supply help to locals on the ground, ramp up our involvement rather than keep pulling it out. And we've managed to sort of stabilize the situation a little bit, and we're now preparing in the spring for some kind of a rollback attempt via the retaking of Mosul. We'll see how that works and so forth. But what this discussion was sort of about was, okay, what if the worrywarts are more correct than the optimists? What if the tide really hasn't turned and our support to our friends and the Kurds and the local Iraqi Shiites hasn't been enough and General Allen's troops won't be enough? What if ISIS seizes the strategic initiative and the tactical initiative and goes on the offensive, either by seriously tackling something like a major target like Baghdad or the oil fields, or strikes out at the U.S. in some truly dramatic way with a terrorist attack causing, if not mass casualties, then high two-figure casualties, let's say. And so in some ways, for me, one of the most interesting questions would be, okay, if that happened, if either of those scenarios played out, if ISIS went back on the offensive and started to keep gaining ground rather than having been checked as they were over the fall, let's say, and if our Mosul thing doesn't necessarily play out, if they took the offensive, would that put the U.S. commitment to this theater back in play in some fundamental way? Would that move us off the relatively middle ground version of containment, which we've sort of come back to? Les Gelb and Dick Betts wrote a great book on Vietnam called The System Worked. And the basic argument was that the U.S. policy response to the Vietnam War was always the middle ground course at any given moment. And it was the middle ground going in, going in, going in, and was the middle ground going out, going out, going out. And essentially it tracked many people. So, right now, the American public and the strategic community doesn't like ISIS, doesn't want to give in, doesn't want to also pay up the costs of truly destroying them, as the president has said we're officially pledged to do. So we've kind of adopted a kind of low-cost, low-return strategy of containment, and let's farm it out to the local allies. So my first major question to you guys is, given what you've heard yesterday, given what you've thought about the situation, if ISIS took the strategic offensive with some kind of major initiative or major attack or major foray, would that force the U.S. to jump fully one way or the other in terms of going back in a big way or pulling out in a big way? Why don't we start with Fred and then go to you guys down?
I mean, I'll start. I think General Cartwright is going to be able to go into some of the experience he's actually can bring from the roles that he's played in Joint Chiefs, et cetera. But let me just give you a feeling of the room for someone. My two colleagues on the left have been in administrations, have been in these rooms. I hadn't in a decision-making capacity before. And you understand why people land at the middle ground. And the dynamics of that kind of National Security Council discussion, as I was on the blue team, was no one wanted to withdraw. And there was some discussion about whether to evacuate the embassy, but not to withdraw entirely. And certainly not to evacuate the embassy, maybe some non-essential personnel. But I think that grew out partly of the experience that one had had with Iraq thus far, where withdrawal didn't really serve our purposes, and also a growing understanding of the larger threat that ISIS poses. But you also got a feeling that these decisions aren't made in 24 hours when something like this happens. You make immediate decisions, and there's the immediate decision you have to make in terms of the security of your personnel and your people in a given situation. There are the immediate decisions you have to make in terms of the evening news, the statement in the Rose Garden, whatever it is. So what the president has to say publicly, and what's the domestic politics of all of that. And then what you really feel in that kind of a situation is the strategic conversation comes, but because you're dealing with immediacy, it's really only great leaders that hang on to the strategic conversation and can really carry it through. And so I think what we really did that I thought was useful is there was an escalation in the U.S. response, but it was an escalation it was a strategic escalation rather than a military escalation. It was looking at issues like command and control. It was looking at things like cyber issues. It was understanding that there's a Syria connection and you can't just deal on the ground in Iraq, but you have to do it in Syria. So instead of what would be a temptation, which is dozens of Americans killed, and therefore let's strike out and do something that makes us all feel good, there was more thought about what would actually weaken, what kind of military action would actually strengthen the network of ISIS rather than weaken it, and what can we do that would actually put us in a position where we're not quite as reactive as we've been before, but we can get a little bit more in front of this and be a bit more proactive. So it was middle ground plus. It was middle ground leaning forward. So the answer, I think, is that where one would go if ISIS gets even more aggressive than it is now, is ultimately, I think you're going to find the U.S., its friends and allies in the region, leaning more forward rather than cutting and running.
Okay. General.
The Goldilocks plus approach is where we ended up in the dialogue. The two extremes which you've highlighted, I think, are important, and we looked at them, and quite frankly, particularly in the scenario, and it's hard not to fight the scenario, but this is the first major event, okay? And I thought there were a series of vulnerabilities that we identified in this activity. One of them was highlighted by the National Intelligence Council, which is, don't think about this as 1 year, 2 year. This is generational warfare, number one. It's the long haul, and ISIS is but a player, a actor at a period of time in this activity. And so trying to keep the strategic long view, trying to keep a strategy and reactions to the realities and the events on the ground in the context of that long view was important. And I thought particularly the allies, the Iraqi players in this game, helped keep that context in the war game. Okay, I got it. This is a problem today. We have to solve this problem, but we have to think in the long term. The question on the extremes is that it's rarely a single event that gets at the resolve to either cut and run or double down, okay? And the question that what I think would be interesting to pursue in a game now is how long, how much, and then what is it that triggers you to go one way or the other, to double down or to cut and run? And what does that look like? Because one of the key vulnerabilities that we identified is the resolve of the allies/coalition, the U.S. And all. What is that like? Because that resolve is an underpinning to the resolve of the region, okay? And it rolls up from there. And so in this case, two different activities, none of which hit the threshold in anybody's mind to do it. And it's likely that the initiation of that dialogue would be, and the governor played the role of the president, would be when he has to go out and explain to the American people why he's got to double down or why it's time to cut and run. When does he actually feel that? And history says it's not a certain number of casualties, it's not a certain number of occurrences. It's probably a stack up of tolerances that go in and ripple down through. But it is a difficult decision, and I don't think you can put a single event to it. But I also am absolutely certain that you cannot measure the value of emotion and how that gets into this. And that resolve is a critical center of gravity for us. It is also a critical vulnerability for us. And we're going to have to manage through a series over a long period of time of challenges to that resolve. And if we understand that going in, then we can underpin our strategy with the types of things that will help us underpin that resolve. That was the dialogue in the game. That was the consensus among the group. And I thought it would not have been reached had it not been to have really valiant red players, the evil enemy, having good role players as the coalition who were not afraid to speak out and to speak their piece, because that put, pressure on any action that we might take, whether it's the president addressing the country on what he's going to do next, or whether it is some military or diplomatic activity that we would undertake to underpin the resolve, help it move forward. The last thing I'll say on this is that it's not easy finding a particular activity, you pick it, some military action, et cetera, that would be consistent with the plans and the interests of all of the allies, particularly in the region. I mean, Turkey will see this very differently than some other country in the Middle East, particularly when we're dealing with borders and movement of people. And so trying to understand what type of an action would actually underpin in a positive way the resolve of the coalition is a difficult activity.
So, Julianne,
Very, very short, just because Bilal said earlier, and you're talking about the others in the room, you referred to the bad guys. It really wasn't that simple, because you had...
don't be nasty about the Europeans.
But you had a lot of discussion about how do we communicate with the Iranians, because in this kind of situation, that's absolutely crucial. You had a lot of intelligence reporting on what the Iranians were actually doing, which is absolutely crucial. You had a lot of talk about how do you communicate to the Russians so that they don't become spoilers, which was absolutely crucial. And you had a lot of gloating on the part of the Syrians in terms of, now you really need us. So there was some real reality in the room in that, and all of these, and you really saw the extent to which all these players were there. And yes, you had the Europeans saying, why aren't you telling us more about what you plan to do so that we can be more publicly dismissive of it. But
that was the Israelis. Okay, I'll get to the allies in a second. Let me take Julianne for 200 on another question. We're in the centenary of World War I now. That famously started with everybody thinking it was going to be a short war, and everybody enthusiastic about bringing the boys home by Christmas. And it ended up being much more closely matched, and everybody's expectations that it would be a short war that they would win didn't pan out, and it ended up being a long, grueling stalemate. I gather that one of the most interesting aspects of the game was the confidence on both sides, ISIS and the anti-ISIS forces, that time was on their side, that resources were on their side, and that the other guys would quickly lose. And to the extent that that was indeed the case, does that suggest that neither side's expectations of a relatively quick or easy victory with the other side walking away with their tail between their legs or being destroyed is likely to pan out, and that this actually could be a very long, hard slog for a very long time until either side is convinced that it really can't win it?
Sure. Well, yes, I was on the evildoers. I was on Team ISIS, the red team. We had a lot of fun with it. There was a lot of swagger, a lot of confidence on the red team. And just to the first part of the discussion here on the question of resolve, I mean, there was a very high level of confidence on the part of Team ISIS that regardless of what the United States is going to do, they had options, that time was on their side, to your question, Gideon. They had an array of tactics they were capable of learning while they're in the middle of the conflict, that yes, the airstrikes that they had seen to date had affected logistics lines, and they're not running huge convoys of hardware across the country now, and their communications have been affected. But by and large, they didn't make any assumptions about the U.S. doubling down and putting in, say, 150 or 200,000 ground troops. And short of that type of commitment, environment, they felt like they could cope with an uptick in kinetic activity, more political and diplomatic efforts, a tightening of the coalition, greater intel ops, special forces, whatever it was that the West was going to do, or the United States, to respond to what had just transpired in Baghdad and then the incident with the huge loss of life. They felt like they were in a mode to make rapid adjustments and always come back with that counter move. And throughout the conversation, the word was, in essence, we'll wait this out. This, even if they double down, we've got more patience. We've got the strategic patience. We're going to play the long game here. There's no short-term fixes. And yes, we may have to retreat here and there, but in the grand scheme of things, we're going to win. We'll continue to be on the offensive. We're not in a defensive crouch. And so who knows if that's truly accurate. Many of us felt like it was, and we felt justified in having that type of confidence. But back to your point, Gideon, you would see when we'd all get together in the plenary, you'd see the same level of confidence on the other side, that they also had options, that they weren't going to cut and run, that they weren't leaving tomorrow, that there was some recognition that this was going to take more than a few short months. And so there was this shared assumption, perhaps a bit more intense on the ISIS side than on the West side, that they were in for the long haul. And but then it begs the question, as you pointed out, are they both making the wrong assumption?
What was the basis, I'm curious, after the experiences of the last decade and a half, what was the basis for the American confidence that we had staying power and or resources and or the ability to sort of confidently see this through?
My sense, and it seemed to come out in the dialogue when we brought the teams together, was that, and I would not, I guess I'm going to couch this in saying I'm not sure this is why we should have been confident, but I think that we were confident in our military capacity, more than confident across the entire spectrum of capabilities, of staying power, of resolve, of political tools, diplomatic tools that were going to be actually useful and didn't actually turn around and bite us. In other words,
So we were confident that we could win any engagement we entered.
Have you ever heard that before?
That's, I'm just raising that thing. Oh, it's like a Bilal wants to jump in.
I would tone down a little bit the confidence
So would I.
level of
Yeah.
blue.
So would I.
I'll speak from the perspective of white, which means that I was only coordinating and I was faithfully observing with utmost objectivity. It was me, Mike, Mark Sipe, and Wiley Barnes who served as coordinators of what you call umpires. I happened to be in the same room with ISIS, so I was hearing basically all their discussions, and my only role basically was just to make sure that the conversation was moving forward. That's it, no intervention. I'll make a remark about what I saw in the plenary, which is when everybody basically presented their findings. And I might have a slight disagreement with what I heard basically coming from blue. I thought that both scenarios, the response was more of the same, quite frankly. It was stay the course, despite the fact there would be perhaps a bit more aggressive form of containment that was primarily military. This might get me in trouble. I slightly disagree with Fred when he said that it's a strategic response. As a matter of fact, I see it more as a tactical response. Much more aggressive, but I was surprised by none of the two scenarios really moved the United States, and it goes back to your earlier question, to really fundamentally change the approach. And I'm not just talking about boots on the ground, but I'm talking about a much more coherent effort to really get into harming severely this organization that seems to be on the offensive. Now, I might be naive and not sensitive enough to the complexity of the domestic, political, considerations that blue was in and the policy complexities of all of it. But, and this was not just coming from me, frankly, it came from the Europeans as well who were in that room. There was a little bit of disappointment, frankly, that the United States was not treating this with utmost urgency and that there had to be some kind of a bigger change in policy from Washington. That's what I observed. And I hope I didn't miscommunicate what Blue was just saying.
Let me go to the allies for a second. Those people who worked on the Middle East peace process, of dear departed memory, used to say that we can't want it more than the locals, right? We should never get too far out ahead, because if we push something and the local parties aren't involved, then it won't work. Even though, of course, we always did want it more than the locals, which is why it never worked. But my question would be, obviously one of the things that was discussed, and there were all these allies, and it clearly is this is something that the United States can't do alone. It's something that the United States doesn't want to do alone. And any solution, if there is going to be one, is going to involve lots of allies. And yet the urgency does not seem to be there, let alone the strategic consensus of the other members of a coalition who have very different interests, very different goals. Did the escalation by ISIS produce any greater cohesion or urgency in the allied coalition, the anti-ISIS coalition, that would be necessary for it to be not just a U.S. problem anymore?
Very, very briefly to the issue of confidence, and then I'll answer your question, because I think they're linked. I don't think there was an equal level of confidence, except for in the military confidence that if there were a fight and the military and the U.S. was unleashed, there's no doubt who would win. But the vulnerability was Iraq. And the vulnerability was the government of Iraq, and could they really stand up? Could they really be cross secular lines? Could they deliver the people? So that was a key vulnerability, and then the key resolve was allies, not only ourselves but others going forward. So I think perhaps away from the plenary and in the blue private sessions, that's what you saw. You also saw a tone shift that was probably stronger in the non-plenary session than came out in the quote-unquote public. And I think that also happens in the real world, where events start shifting the tone in the National Security Council conversations. And so much of that does have to do around presidential leadership. And we also saw that in our engagement. So now to your question on allies, there was a lot of reference to Turkey and the Saudis needing to call the Turks, needing to call the Saudis, needing to call our Gulf friends, the UAE, keeping them on board, seeing what they're thinking about, also Syria, what we do in Syria. And so, but in the actual game, we didn't get to play that out that well. There's so much you can do in a given day, and there weren't joint sessions between the Europeans and the U.S. during the game that we had. That is something that obviously we have to correct before we get into the next game, although one wag sort of jested that this wasn't so far from the real world. But
so did the regional allies increase their commitment to solving the problem when ISIS escalated?
In the dialogue around so what, I think there were two categories, as you there was the non-regional group portion of the alliance and the regional portion of the alliance. The regional portion of the alliance certainly had a significantly higher imperative to do something, to act in a way. The problem was that it was not coherent. In other words, it came from very different ways, as you might imagine. Okay, but clearly people were willing to donate, so to speak, capability, will, and whatnot, in kind in their interests. Okay, on the European side, I thought it was interesting. The French were very focused and very reactive based on the Paris activities, the terrorist activities. And they had much more vigor in what they wanted to accomplish and much more will to move forward. It had not yet defined itself as to what that would look like, but it was there in the emotion, okay? But it did not seem to affect the rest of Europe. Now, this is a game, okay, but you could take it. It did not seem to affect, and quite frankly, again, the problem was a problem that we were trying to solve. The hammer seemed to be military action, and all focus went to that. And the reality of what are the tools that could be applied diplomatically, particularly for the long fight, that we might want to ramp up. What do those tools look like, and can we actually bring them together as a coalition? You know, and we explored several tools that would require various elements of the alliance to do things that today probably would be considered not in their own interest, okay? And that would be very challenging, and the question was, okay, if that's true, then what are the tools that we could use? A very small number one, that would be useful, but maybe we better get to work on getting some of the more useful tools to build an agreement and a consensus around those tools.
Bilal and Julianne want to get in on this.
Brief statement. You can imagine that the partners and the allies had different concerns and different preferences, but the key takeaway and that I saw was everybody was looking for U.S. leadership. Everybody was looking for U.S. clarity on intentions, and they couldn't find it.
Okay, Julianne?
Well, I think there's a couple of options when something like this happens, when you have huge loss of life in an incident like in the second scenario. You can have the coalition crumble because people get nervous and they start to go wobbly. You can have it solidify the coalition, but politically and diplomatically only. Or it can trigger a whole new set of policy options and actions. And I think what we saw in this game is we kind of landed in the middle the way it played out. It reminded me actually a little bit of, like, as we look at Minsk collapsing, you know, Europe and the United States remain united on Ukraine, Russia, but it's not triggering a whole new array of options. And I saw that mirrored a little bit in this discussion. Like, we'll stay together, we're all here, shoulder to shoulder, but we don't necessarily have to talk about doubling down on military action or any of that. Second point I wanted to mention is in the category of allies, I mean, we turned in a very traditional way to our regional partners and friends and the Europeans, a list that would be familiar to everyone in this group, but also what was the, 800-pound gorilla in the room were those three countries, the Syrians, the Iranians, and the Russians, saying, you might want to think twice about how you look at us. Seems like we now need to be in the partner and ally category. And for me, I mean, the person who ended up playing Putin was just pitch perfect, and she did a terrific job. And it was haunting, though, how many times she would grab the microphone, like, "Are you ready for our help now? You created this problem, but we're here to help you get out of it." And that it felt very real.
So let me actually follow up on that to the panel in general. So we're here at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. If you were a sort of good old-fashioned realpolitiker approaching this, there's a lot of different allies with a lot of different capabilities and a lot of different issues in play. It is not beyond the bounds of human intelligence or creativity for armchair strategists to come up with all sorts of compromise deals, linking various kinds of side deals to various kinds of actions and putting together, okay, look, I'll give you this on this, you give me this on this, and working out a kind of careful thing in which you get enough of what you want on enough issues, and you trade off other things. In the real world, of course, especially the real world of American politics, those kinds of linkages are almost never done because there are communities of interest, there are congressional constituencies, there are political constituencies around each set of relationships. And when they start to go, you can't really trade off X against Y. We're seeing that with Iran and Israel right now, right, in which sort of the administration's attempt to do a sort of region-wide shifting of things is getting blocked because different components are not taking part in that, or domestically. Would it be possible, even if in theory, it'd be possible to make deals with Assad, with Putin, with Iran, with Turkey, with the Saudis, various things. In practice, did the blue team find any kind of domestic flexibility to rearrange the map of U.S. regional alliances and cut deals across issues? But Putin, for example, would have presumably wanted us to back off some issues in Ukraine. The Iranians would have wanted a little more leverage in the nuclear negotiations. Is there any sense from anybody here that Washington could have given any of that, even if it would have helped to create a more viable and stronger ISIS policy?
To the extent that these kinds of things can happen in one short war game, I would think that and it's almost not right to call it a war game because there's so many other things involved that were non-military in this. But you have a situation where you clearly have the Gulf most worried about Iranian intervention and also most worried about what's the real relationship of the U.S. with Iran here, and is there some sort of alliance building here that's going to be against our interests? On the other hand, you have this realization as well. Our Gulf allies aren't entirely satisfied with what we've done so far in Syria. And so there was talk about creating a no-fly zone as a way to get at ISIS, but also as a way to signal to our Gulf allies that that we expected them to help us out here in this kind of situation, but we were also going to be a little bit more forward-leaning in trying to satisfy their concerns regarding Syria. Now, General Cartwright may have read that a little bit differently, but that's the way I
What would the no-fly zone in Syria do?
I'll turn to the person who was going to create it for us.
It was very difficult to find any particular issue that didn't have somebody be disaffected by it. Okay,
absolutely.
Even we talked about two different stages of no-fly zone because one of the vulnerabilities here is anchored on the construct of sovereignty and borders, and that over the long term, borders and the movement across borders, whether it be of refugees or whether it be of arms and whatnot, is a major problem and a contributor to these kind of spikes in activity. So how would we think about getting at that over the longer run? But even in the discussion about different types of no-fly zones, the interests of various parties made it very difficult to have a coherent approach to that. Some were worried about refugee issues and would that create a zone in which they could manage refugee issues, or was it going to be designed such that the refugees would flow more freely, you know? And some were worried about arms and the length of border and et cetera. So it was very difficult to craft something. My sense here is that that's reality. We were clearly in a decision, that you can argue with, but we were in the Goldilocks. So we had discounted double down. We had discounted leaving. Now we were trying to figure out how do you prepare for the next time that you're going to be put in this situation and have to decide between those options. And how do you start to strengthen your case? And we were looking for venues by which you could do that. And it was clear early that you weren't going to get complete consensus. The question was, could you get something that was meaningful enough that it would change the character in a way that was favorable to the long term, but not necessarily, play into somebody's hand in the short term? It was going to be really difficult.
Bilal, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, just very clearly, the other side was very aggressive about side dealing and all that. I mean, Julie mentioned Russia and the Iranians. I really thought for a second we had President Assad in the room, played terrifically by a gentleman. The Syrians always wanted to be the ones reaching out to the Americans and saying that we are a legitimate government, we're here in the same fight. Same for the Iranians, even trying to finagle that into the Iranian nuclear talks. It was a lot of that from the other side, but I didn't see any from Washington.
So let me ask you a question on this. Let me press on something. It's obvious, it makes total sense that everybody would be disaffected by something. And that there would be some things that people didn't want. And that any deal or any real policy would not give some parties what we wanted. But what's interesting, and again, a true realpolitiker would say, okay, I understand that. That's the way the world is. We're just going to stuff the concerns of some of the lesser actors and go with a deal that actually plays it. Was there any sense that there were actors, even who were disaffected, that we would basically just tell, suck it up, because we're moving forward anyway without you? Or were even the relatively smaller actors able to exercise a veto on a broader log rolling deal by being disaffected. I mean, one of the things that I see with U.S. strategy now, we can see this in Congress domestically as well as sort of in foreign policy, is that if the process is broken, it's not just there are disaffected people, it's that everybody gets a voice. And if you have to, if you can't overrule somebody's objections, anybody's objections, you'll never get anything done. So was there a willingness on the part of the blue team to be prepared to tell some even, let's say minor strategic allies, you know what, suck it up. You're not going to get what you want. We're going forward anyway. Or is there a sense that, well, you're not going to do that, in which case you end up doing this saddle point, middle of the road policy that doesn't change anything?
I think there were two cases where we had that kind of a discussion. One was in the construct early on of we're going to stay, we're going to get the government back into Baghdad, we're going to reestablish it, was to say, okay, Iran, give us time, give us a little time, find back channels to do that. Don't intervene right now. I know it will be hard, but we're asking for some time here to get this set. So that was one. The second was on more traditional allies. We looked at a course of action that would potentially get at a center of gravity we thought was on the red side, which was their ability to disseminate their message. And that would require allies outside of the area in Europe to do some things that they probably wouldn't want to do. And we discussed that, and both of those were cases where I think we would have gone to, you're going to have to suck it up. So, but these were choices and options that were going to be not in the first day of the dialogue. They were going to be things that had to be sat down and negotiated. And we tried to come up with a reasonable laundry list of capabilities. And each one of them were really going to be putting somebody to the test of doing something that they didn't particularly want to do.
And the second one, I think, was particularly crucial because it's in the information war, the propaganda war, where we haven't been purposeful enough, and there was a decision to become a lot more purposeful. And a lot of the messaging is taking place out of countries that would not be happy if we went after that purposefulness. So I thought that was a very important decision and did take things into that direction. It was interesting, though, how the way you phrased the question didn't really come up in our discussions. It wasn't, okay, we're going to roll this ally, we're going to ignore this ally. It was more, what do we need to get done?
Yeah.
What do we need to get done?
Which usually involves rolling some ally.
Yeah, but there's.
We had good intentions.
Yeah. but it really, and there certainly was a lot of discussion about it having to be a coalition and having it to be with your allies, and there was a lot of discussion about who was going to call what ally at what time, make sure it gets out there before the news, all of that business, simply because there was a feeling that the more the U.S. had to lead and engage perhaps more than it had out of this, but that messaging itself could be counterproductive in terms of ISIS propaganda, and so you really had to bring together your coalition.
I'm going to stay with U.S. politics for 300 before turning it over to the audience, but let me just say that on a side note, I personally find in some ways, the most interesting aspect of this whole contretemps with the Netanyahu speech and the Iran policy is this question of sort of the linkage of different regional issues and the question of whether Washington is able to pursue a policy that it chooses to or thinks is best, even in the face of an ally's disagreement. If it can't do that, then we might as well just give up the idea of strategy more generally, because every issue is going to be on its own and determined by those constituencies. But this broader question of if there's going to be a trade-off, can you even manage to pull it off when the people who are going to be traded off for whatever reason can block it?
Not just Israel, but the Arab Gulf states too.
Yeah.
Just one sentence. If there's anything this exercise brings about, is a lot of sympathy for policymakers, and this is hard stuff.
Policymakers, elected or appointed?
Both. Both.
Well, let me stay on that. Okay,
Yeah.
so one of the interesting things in the game was some of the different perspectives between the elected officials and the appointed officials and the advisors and so forth. And the sensitivity, of course, of the elected officials to the political ramifications of what they were doing, the messaging and the ways that would be sold domestically, the follow-on debate at home that would follow from any of the actions and so forth. I like the way that you put it, General, which is we ruled out running away, and we ruled out actually getting involved in the war. So then the question was, okay, since we know both of those are politically unpalatable, what minor tweaks can we do on the existing middle ground policy that make it sound like we're being tough and maybe do something actually substantive, but don't cost anybody too much, either practically or politically? And I guess my question to the panel would be. Are the domestic constraints on, it seems to me that the American public and or Congress and the American political climate, let's say that, is sending the following signals up, and as I read the game. You can't pull out or withdraw in a way that seems like a defeat or humiliating, because that's political death, or rather political discomfort at the very least, which is equivalent to death for politicians. You can't actually get involved on the ground because the public doesn't want to lose a lot of lives and doesn't want to be involved in another major land war in the Middle East. But you have to talk as if you're doing something tougher than what you're currently doing now, and you have to be seen to respond. So your policy constraints are don't run, don't get into a war, sound tough, and whatever you can cobble together in those constraints that does a half-assed way of dealing with the situation functionally is kind of okay. Is that a misreading of the constraints that?
I would say it differently, but I don't know that it would be a lot substantively different. But in what we looked at, particularly on the appointed rather than, was what types of things could we do that first would bolster the long-term strategy and the coalition resolve, et cetera, and then can we then take that activity and give to it a character that is near-term? Okay, so an example would be one of the critical centers of gravity for the Iraqis is their critical infrastructure. Can we use our capability, our ISR, et cetera, to help them defend that critical infrastructure so that in the long term they can provide services to their people? And in the short term, when we do that, can we do something that's very visible to both ISIS and to the Iraqi people, like a series of aerostats and things around critical areas that would be visible? And so we talked through, and that was one example, but we talked through several things that could, and this was kind of creative thinking on the fly, but could we do activities that were really focused on the long term but had a very visible impact in the short term? And that's the kinds of things we were trying to develop for the National Security Council.
Did you come to any of those?
We came to a series of, I would say, not more than 3 or 4. It's hard to really get the visibility. Having the base in the green zone, the character of those change, in visible ways. Having the ability to get out and amongst and to put visible signs like the aerostats, visible signs like not forces, but Iraqi forces moving freely in the area. We talked about a critical activity which was really bothersome to us, which was more to do with the second scenario, but the amount of American capabilities, trucks, vehicles, weapons, et cetera, that are in the hands of ISIS, how to differentiate them very clearly in a way that would do
Since
that.
they've stolen our trucks.
And, and make that visible so that people could see that, and we'd have a reason. And there are ways to do that, but those were the kinds of things. And again, this is 35 minutes, okay? So the creativity had a certain limit to it, but that was the thought process, but difficult to do for the reasons that you laid out.
Bilal and Julianne want to get in?
You want to go to Q&A? I'll be brief. Talk about putting these guys in a really tough position, but that's the whole point of the war game, to see how they would react to something so catastrophic. I'm going to mention something everybody knows already. There was absolutely nothing the United States would do that would actually defeat ISIS. Even boots on the ground would not defeat ISIS. We're talking here about an ideology. Clearly, it's a symptom. ISIS is a symptom of a much broader problem. And all the other political reconciliation things, the good governance stuff, that's going to take a long time. And so whatever they would muster, it was not going to solve the problem.
Would you just, a two-finger on that, is the same true of Syria, that there was nothing that came up that anybody could suggest that would fundamentally change the situation in Syria or solve the civil war there?
The dialogue really was less about doing that and more about, okay, are we getting close because of how good Putin was in this game? Are we getting to a point, and what would it look like if we came to a conclusion that our presence was actually contributing to ISIS rather than discriminating against it?
In Syria?
In Syria and Iraq, but in other words, the Assad issue, and we kind of cut it off because we knew we could spend a lot of time on that and it wouldn't have served the game. But there was a lot of discussion about a couple of types of issues associated with Syria that could change the character of our strategy.
Julianne wanted to get in first.
Just to your point on the question of public opinion, you presented, a pretty accurate snapshot of what the administration is facing right now, I think, and what the folks in the game felt like they were facing and the constraints. But it's even more complicated than you paint it. I think it is a snapshot, and what's hard for policymakers is that public opinion can be so schizophrenic and can change so rapidly. So even in the case of the CW attack, where we saw that there wasn't any public support for the president to go in with military strikes in Syria, then we saw with the beheadings how quickly then public opinion started to ask wider questions. How should we be responding? Should we be getting more involved? And so as a policymaker, you can take that current snapshot and wring your hands and say, wow, I don't have a lot of room. But you can also get caught by feeling trapped in that and not understanding that over the course of a few weeks, public opinion can turn on a dime. And suddenly people are asking you, why aren't we doing more? Why are we sitting on our hands? And so it's so much more complicated than a couple of pew polls that come out. You have to understand throughout moments in our history how rapidly public opinion can just, again, turn on a dime.
Was there any sense in which the timing of this in the presidential cycle had any impact? I mean, when I think back to Reagan and Lebanon, maybe the fact that it was 82, the second year of his first term, was an ability to walk away. And maybe if it was just coming up on a major re-election and things hadn't been going well, it'd been more difficult. There was a mention of an upcoming, both trying to do things on the presidential level to leave a legacy, but also a heightened political climate because of the presidential election. Was there, if this all was playing out at a different time in the U.S. political cycle, would any of the factors be different? I don't know. I'm just raising that as a question for you guys to ask.
That's far beyond the scope of the game.
It's just a gut sense.
Politics will always have an influence, and just like in the decision we were making about double down versus turn, does a president act in a way that is, okay, I'm in a position to do this and I'll do it, or does he act in a way that says, okay, I don't really want to handle this, I'll put status quo and wait for my relief to take this issue on.
I'll punt on that.
And it's really, and it's really tough. It's, that's hypothetical, and you could go any way.
I mean, domestic politics is part of the environment of the conflict, and the U.S. has its domestic politics, which is quite easy to see. And that gives ISIS a clearer way to operate. They were quite confident because of the U.S. domestic politics that there was only a range of things that they were going to face, and none of them were
So
to
the
be worried
ISIS
about.
were sophisticated observers of American politics and felt that they could use the constraints to their advantage.
While we were less sophisticated observers of ISIS politics and how we could use their politics to hurt them.
That strikes me as both totally accurate and a very important point
Yeah.
to make.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn this over to the audience. Let me just say one last comment on this, which is, I mean, as I see it, this game was kind of like a stress test for our ISIS policy. And what you did was you kind of shoved it. And it turned out that the policy is kind of robust because it's at a saddle point. And it's going to take more than even the things that you ginned up in this game to shake it off its current saddle point. And now it would be I still think it would be a very interesting question if you were to double or triple the stress, which way the policy would jump. But clearly what this game has shown is that it's not a fragile, delicate policy. It's one that is the resultant of a lot of different forces operating and coming to a sort of middle ground. Yeah. And it's going to be hard to shake us out of it. Is that sense that I'm getting from all this incorrect?
Yeah,
That was an excellent summary.
Yeah, and partly contributed to by what's happened with ISIS in Libya and what's happening with ISIS elsewhere, that it also firms up the convictions.
A lot of people want to get in, so we're going to have over here, then over here, then over here. Yes.
Oh, Aberdeen, in your gaming, it seems to me you forgot one critical component. ISIS is a sect. ISIS is a group of people who believe in absurdities. And when people believe in absurdities, they burn people, they kill people, and therefore they're not strategic. If you look at the region today, they're hated, they're surrounded. The Lebanese are against them. The Syrians are against them. The Iranians, the Jordanians, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the French. So you have this sect that will, in my view, 2 years from now, they'll disappear. Who's going to supply them with weapons? Where are they going to get their food? How are they going to pay the people? And lastly, they control an area that is mainly desert. 95% of what they control is desert. Only 5% of what they control is arable land with population. Now, Bilal said one thing which I usually agree with, but I do not agree with him. The ideology of this group has no backing in the region. People laugh at them. You know, people think these guys are a bunch of killers. So again, we must keep in mind they're a sect. And we had many sects in the region in the last 1,200 years. They lasted for 2-3 years, and then they died down. So I think they can be defeated, they can be eliminated, but what we need to do is, since we're in the Scowcroft Center, we need to look at the Scowcroft strategy in 1991. We built a coalition. We had the Egyptians and we had the Syrians. We had other allies. And I think what the region needs, or what the region wants, they want the U.S. to lead, but at the same time, this time, the people in the region are willing to commit people, money, to defeat ISIS.
From your lips to God's ears, Oda, I will say, though, that,
2 years from now we'll meet.
that Scowcroft felt that Saddam would go away pretty quickly, too, and it turned out that didn't actually happen for another decade. But Bilal, I'll give you a chance to defend yourself and to...
No, I know that Julie wants to speak on that since she was part of the ISIS team. I think all the panelists, and I believe most of the audience would agree with you that ISIS will self-destruct, and this is not really an organization that has a lot of staying power, but our concern is that as it falls apart, it will attempt to cause as much damage, and try to basically attack U.S. strategic interests, and our concern is that we need to have some kind of a response for that. This organization is not really going to simply
go gentle for that good night.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a lot of trends in the region, and there's undisputable evidence basically from Libya, from Egypt, from Lebanon, from Saudi Arabia that they are really trying to pull off some very sophisticated attacks, and that the trend is only going to increase, and you got to have some kind of response for that before they ultimately self-destruct. We can't just wait for that to happen, and you don't really have a policy response for it. But I know that Julie has much more about that.
Well, I think that's right, but also, I mean, if time is, on our side, the question is how long can the Iraqi government hold out, and what kind of bolstering and support will they need to see it through this storm? And in light of the fact that they have been able to attract a pretty impressive number of foreign fighters, their resources, at least early on, have been flowing and are in their favor. I mean, it's not all a gloomy picture. I mean, I agree largely with what you're saying, and it will ultimately, we all hope, lead to their demise. And I think we can have that confidence playing out over perhaps years. But in the short term, there's sure a lot that they can do. And knowing the weaknesses of the Iraqi regime and the sectarian conflict and divides that exist, and how they can prey on that and go after some of the Sunnis. And I mean, there are trends that I think should keep us awake at night and will present challenges for the US government and will get at this heart of the resolve question. And so it's not to be taken lightly. I mean, I certainly take your point, but I think there's plenty to give us pause.
Over here, yes.
Thank you, Farah Hatasi, National Syrian Women Association. I have two quick questions. Number one, I would like to ask on what basis did you suggest that Assad can be partner on the war against ISIS, whereas he's the main winner out of this whole new situation? Why would he fight them where the whole world attention shifted from the daily crimes he's committing against the Syrian people to the crimes that ISIS is committing? On daily basis, there are more Syrians killed by Assad and his allies than those killed by ISIS. So why would we suggest that he will actually fight them when he's taking advantage of the whole situation, trying to be legitimized again in the international community? That will lead me to the other question about grouping allies. Now, you grouped allies like the GCC, Turkey, all those involved in the war against ISIS. What about the Syrian opposition? If we are talking about boots on the grounds, right now, if there is boots on the grounds, they are the Syrian moderate opposition who are actually fighting ISIS the past 2 years, literally and physically, and they, with a very small, inadequate help, military help, they've been able to liberate a lot of areas, but they couldn't sustain that liberation because there was no help. So did you invite the Syrian opposition, who are the main allies, actually, to the United States and to the other partners, arming them, helping them with the intelligence work, with the communication? And Turkey and the United States just signed a few days ago an agreement on training 5,000. How many ISIS in Syria? How many in numbers? I mean, sometimes I say, if like we're 20 million Syrians, if we just, just left to fight them alone, that will be fine. So I think you should invite the Syrian opposition to be one of your main allies in this situation, because they are physically on the ground right now fighting ISIS with a very poor tools and equipment. Thank you.
Just for the record, we had a member of the Syrian opposition, by the way, participate in the war game, but we obviously cannot divulge names.
Right. And what role did the Syrian opposition play in the American strategy, end up playing?
Okay. You obviously don't have a lot of passion on this issue, but the one assumption that we undertook to address, just to have one of them done, was the assumption that somebody, and it was brought up by the Russians, that Assad should stay. So we elected to have a discussion about the reality of that, and quickly came to that was not a viable approach. We clearly picked our options, to support this middle ground, the military options, to align and to consider the activities in Syria, Assad. In other words, how could we actually turn that game over the long term also to a favorable outcome? And so that was one of the reasons that we started down the path of no-fly zones and things like that, because it wasn't a direct attack on ISIS, but it was clearly a thought process of what does this look like when it's over the long term, and we don't want to reinforce something in the short term that we don't want to have exist in the long term. And so there was a good discussion about that. Good. 10, 15 minutes we spent on it. I apologize, but that's all we had. But that was the one assumption that we elected to have a discussion on. And we didn't,
But I do want to make clear, we did not make the decision we wanted to combine with Assad against ISIS. Assad was in the room and he wanted us to make that decision.
And the Russians.
But the decision instead was to open up this no-fly zone where the Syrians were saying, well, that can't be conducted against ISIS because they have no planes, so yeah, you're right. But it helped with intelligence gathering, it helped with operations against ISIS, but it also sent a message to Assad at the same time that, that he should not rest so easily as well.
Over here, and then over here. So green first, then red tie.
I'm Harlan Ullman. An observation to respond to my good friend Ode. When the Islamic State came into Mosul, their hashtag was Sykes-Picot, which is rather interesting. I have a question for General Cartwright, and Jim, I would prefer not a one-word answer, which you could easily give me. War implies a chain of command and a table of organization. I'm confused in the current White House structure who's really in charge of dealing with the Islamic State. I'm fundamentally baffled about how the coalition of 62 and 20 are organized, even though they've got working group. I don't know who's in charge. You've got at least 4 combatant commanders and a 5th if you include the CIA who are participating. You've got John Allen, you've got General Terry, and you've got the country team in Baghdad. Could you give me your views about how you see we're organized to deal with a 21st century threat, but with a 20th century organization?
At least you didn't put me on the spot. We actually did spend a little bit of time looking at this because we had a role player who was from CENTCOM. And what we seized on, in our few minutes of discussion was that the combined operations center in Baghdad would be the place that we would centrally start to exercise control with the Iraqis, and that to an earlier question, the Iraqis had to come.
But who's the we?
Right now it was CENTCOM. The question then was, we will need to figure out the answer to the questions because it is too fragmented right now. Now, that's not a character assassination of anybody who's trying to do what they're trying to do. But one of the things that we did highlight, and CENTCOM was very clear on, was that operations center really did create a unified hub. Everybody that was interested, absent the 3 players, had a representative there. And so that was where we were going to go as a physical location. Physical location does not equal command and control, but at least it started us down that path, and that was as far as we could get into the discussion.
Okay, yes, over here.
Just to follow up on a point that you made just recently, did you have any sense to what extent the dispossessed Sunni intelligentsia are in fact supporting ISIL, if only on a covert basis, and providing the water in which the guerrilla fish can swim?
No, that's a very good question. We probably didn't drill that deep within ISIS. We had a little bit of a conversation just about Sunnis in general. I think if you run around town and talk to any subject matter expert, most folks will agree that we can't expect to see some sort of Sunni awakening on the scale that we had several years ago. That said, we wanted to take a minute and ask a question. Would there be any circumstance in which we could expect the West to pull some of the Sunnis back towards their side, away from ISIS? And one of the scenarios we looked at were in cases where there would be a large number of internally displaced persons, IDPs, and whether or not the West would be able to, quote, kind of almost capitalize on that by providing services that ISIS was, in essence, unable to provide to that displaced group. I mean, part of their play is obviously moving in with the social services right away and the videos that accompany it and all the rest. And so we were talking about, what should we as ISIS be concerned about in terms of the West pulling those Sunnis back? And other than a very short conversation on that subject, again, we're dealing with just hours of time here, we weren't really able to get to the heart of your question. I'm sorry.
Yes, over here first. You're getting a mic.
I'm Tom Duncan, a U.S. Army War College Fellow at George Mason University. I'm just curious what the group's thoughts were on elements outside of Iraq and Syria that are picking up the ISIS brand name, and what are the implications for U.S. policy?
Did ISIS have an external affairs department? A common term, an Islam term?
I think you go back, though, and I'll just jump in here, but one is an understanding that no borders in their mind, okay? This is their caliphate in the region, so to speak. Two, that they are but a franchise, and they will probably be replaced by another franchise. That franchise may have the same name. It may hold that name in one area and have a name in a different area, but we're clearly in the franchising side of this equation rather than a single movement, and a single movement that will persist.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what I would add to that. We did talk a little bit in the group about the advantage of the branding and the advantage of being able to claim credit for things which we had virtually nothing to do with, that it was an advantage to us from a messaging standpoint where we chose to select certain incidents and say that was driven by us, that was either inspired by us or directly a part of our mission, and how that would benefit us because we could show global ISIS in a way that would attract more foreign fighters, hopefully, or even local fighters to our cause, or scare and threaten our adversaries. And so there was great pride and confidence in the branding piece.
There was a discussion about how this was a network that we were attacking as an organization, and therefore when you hit it militarily, as devastating as that single military strike might be, or even a series of them, you may actually, and we're seeing this happening, strengthen the network. Its recruiting capability, its funding capability, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not as, Oda and I usually agree on most of these things, and on this one I'm not sure I do. And I think the analysis now shows that they've gone into Libya, they've partnered with jihadist groups and organized criminal groups. They are now, they've asked Libyans that they were recruiting to stay at home and join the fight there. They're doing that in Europe now, where they were recruiting before. Now they're saying, no, please stay here to carry out local attacks. So as absurdist as they may be, or other people call them apocalyptic, there's a mixture of people there for the excitement, the money, the jobs, the girls, whatever it is. There's people there for the ideology. But there's something in this that's catching on. And then, of course, there's the whole outraged Sunni side of it in Iraq, which has a whole different dimension to it. So I wouldn't be quite as dismissive as will self-destruct and will disappear from the scene. We've seen leaders in the past who one dismissed when they were first rising, and movements when one first dismissed as absurdist that ended up being much more trouble than we ever counted on.
Just a two-finger. I thought I saw a good amount of that in red. This is not your typical insurgent movement, right? And there was I saw a lot of tension in how this is not your typical rational actor, right? A lot of what they do is informed by an ideology that they actually really believe in. I mean, we have to take them for their own words. Otherwise, we're not taking this seriously. So I would see that every now and then, how strategic they are and how absolutely nuts they are. I mean, they're making enemies out of everybody. What is the point of that? And so a lot of that was captured in the red discussions.
Over there and then over there.
Hi, Jeff Schmidt. So I'm a cyber guy, so I have to ask the cyber question. To what extent, if any, did cyber sorts of issues come up during the game? And I guess there's two sides to that. There's the offensive side to disrupt their command and control systems, propaganda, recruiting, finances, all those sorts of logistical things to degrade. But then also the defensive reality that typically cyber blowback occurs whenever the West does anything by supporters and such. Thank you.
We did not, by design, burrow down into individual capabilities. We looked at electronic means, which included cyber, as a venue by which we might be able to disrupt, in particular, what we thought was one of their key centers of gravity, which is their messaging. And then the implications of that for allies
And were you able to
in the
disrupt
region.
it?
I'm sorry?
Were you able to disrupt it?
Again, we didn't go to that extent. We just said, there are things out there that we could do. What would they look like? And then the real debate was your earlier question of who would not want you to do that? What would be the ramifications, which would eventually get to your defensive issues, et cetera. But we didn't go that far.
Yes, over here.
Hi, my name is Amanda Hare. I work at Dexis Consulting Group in the international development sphere. But my question is about kind of the next game, and it sounds like one of your key assumptions during this game, and I realize you were limited by time and scope, was that your regional allies, Egypt, Jordan, Iran, remain the same internally with their government structures. But you have Yemen falling apart on the outskirts. You have Egypt taking actions into its own hands, bombing Libya, doing a military action for the first time in a really long time, trying to enter the sphere. You also have a weak government in Afghanistan still trying to get its footing. There's an area where we could also be taxed here in the West. And also a Saudi government that's going through transition. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how you either approached that possibility of losing a regional ally, or if this was outside of the scope of your game.
That's a great question to conclude on, because what I want to do is use that to segue. Bilal, you're going to talk about the next game, and I want each of you then to give me your big takeaways from this game, and what you learned, and what you think the really interesting major takeaways are from what this experience was. And then Bilal, you could talk about the next one.
So actually, we're doing a third one?
What?
We're doing a third one? I wasn't sure of that.
I thought there was the one on more general case.
I'm kidding. You could always add extra layers of complexity just to make it as realistic as possible. And I completely agree with you that those are very sensible considerations, but they were certainly beyond the scope of this war game. Now, for the next one, as much as you want to add complexity to it, at the end of the day, you got to control a few things, right? I mean, with these types of exercises, you can really easily lose sense of direction and clarity of purpose, and you got to control some things. But we'll certainly keep those in mind for the third one, which, in my opinion, will be a little bit more of a strategic nature, and try to get into solutions and looking at it from a much more holistic perspective, less military operational.
Okay. And what were your big takeaways from this game?
I think we already mentioned it. I thought that Red had the strategic momentum. They had the initiative. Blue was a little bit confused about what to do. There was a lack of coordination with the Europeans. There was a lot of disappointment on the part of the Europeans. As I mentioned before, everybody looking for U.S. leadership. And in many ways, frankly, it reflected reality. But I would really want to emphasize one more time, it's unfair to them that we put them in this situation. But in life, it could happen. It could very easily happen.
Julianne, what were your big takeaways?
Just two quick things. I guess the first would be for policymakers, the challenge of finding that sweet spot when you're in the middle of a crisis between kind of strategic patience and overreacting. And so the blue team, you could see them catching themselves. Let's not overreact. Let's not double down and suddenly throw ground troops in. We don't want to do that. But let's not sit on our hands. We need to show a shift in policy. But you could see the challenges of finding that middle ground. The second thing I would note is kind of the strategic objectives of the two groups of the United States and ISIS. The United States trying to degrade, destroy ISIS. ISIS is the target. For ISIS, it was less about the United States and the West, although certainly there are advantages in coming, trying to get American hostages and all the rest, pushing back on any military operations. But for ISIS, the target was really the Iraqi government in order to expand and maintain the caliphate. And that mismatch in goals had consequences at times as they both tried to outline their next steps.
General Cartwright.
This one mirrors what we just heard, but the long war and that degrade and destroy is not about the long war. It's about the short-term thing. It's about the current fight, the current challenges, and that we've allowed the focus to move to the short-term goal, okay? And then you risk losing the focus on the long term. Second was that we're clearly vulnerable right now in particular, but probably over an extended period of time in the Iraqi capacity to govern, okay? And to a lesser extent their capability, but more so to their capacity. And then the second vulnerability is the U.S. and the allies resolve, that it's particularly vulnerable right now. This event was not enough to shake it, but over a period of time, a series of events, you could find yourself in that position. And then the last is the issue of sovereignty, which played a little bit to our conversation about Syria, is how are we going to manage borders in this kind of thing? And it played a little bit to the Army question. How is that going to work? How are we going to do it? How are we going to maintain some elements of this Westphalian approach to values and whatnot? And what would sovereignty look like? And we got into this because of the discussion about a no-fly zone and the differences between particularly the Turkish, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and other players in the region about why they wanted their borders to be preserved, and that was an area of vulnerability that we had to come to some consensus on, and we didn't get there.
Fred.
Yeah, let me pick up on the short-term, long-term that General Cartwright pointed to, and also then speak 30 seconds as president of the Atlantic Council too, because this fits into everything we're doing. And that is short-term, long-term, it's tactics, strategy. And General Scowcroft talks about how during the Cold War we had a strategy containing the Soviet Union, communism, and then what was difficult was tactics. And now we've got plentiful tactics but insufficient strategy. And so I think part of the reason I'm happy we'll go to strategy in this third round is you're not going to summon domestic support over the long term unless you can actually tell the American people this is our strategy and it is concerted and this is how it fits in. Otherwise, everything comes up and it's either whack-a-mole or you don't know how it fits into your strategy. And I think we really have to get there, particularly on this issue, but more largely the Middle East, and then I would say more largely regarding America's role in the world. It's tough to do, but I think right now it's going to be absolutely crucial for us to actually know where to put our resources going forward.
It's been a great session. I just realized that I have one more question, but I'm going to give you each a one-word answer. So it's yes, no, or maybe.
Uh-oh.
Will the offensive against Mosul in the spring succeed?
Maybe.
How about it depends?
I'll count that as maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No. So
I don't
three
know.
maybes? Well, you don't know.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's a big,
Yeah.
interesting variable out there.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, and it's prior to game 3, so it'll be interesting.
Can I just mention that a publication is coming out of the second war game that we will make available in the next couple of weeks?
Absolutely. Thank you all for coming. Thank all of the panelists.
That was great. That was terrific.